Welcome my darlings, thank you for joining me on another video. If you see me for the very first time, my name is Annie and I post true crime cases here on my channel. So if true crime is your kind of thing, you're welcome to my channel. So for today's case, we are back to South Africa where we shall be looking into the case of a serial offender. Have you ever heard that a police officer who is meant to serve and protect instead turns and begins to take lives? It's not common, but it happens. This is the case of Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu. Rosemary was born in 1975 in New Forest Village in Bushbuckridge in Mpumalanga province of South Africa. Life for Rosemary was quite tough from the beginning. Her mother Maria did all she could to provide for the family, which was inclusive of two younger sisters, that's Aubrey and Nomasondo. I am not sure who her father was or if he was involved in her life. I couldn't find anything about him. So even though the family struggled, Rosemary's mother Maria did what she could to send the kids to school. She worked in farms and did many jobs to keep up with school fees and to buy meat for her kids to feed. People who knew Rosemary described her as a tough young lady. She was more of a tomboy, if you know what I mean. She could take what most young ladies could not take on, as they might view it as masculine stuff, but Rosemary was not one of those. In her mind, what a man can do, a woman can do better. So she went on to graduate high school and get her matric certificate. There was no money at the time to go on to a proper university. Aside this, she loved the uniform, so she enrolled in the South African Police Academy where she trained to become a police officer. Being a police officer was easy breezy for Rosemary. As a constable, she with her tomboyish ways fit in with the boys quite easily. She seemed dedicated to her job and was quite good at it as well. Her family was very proud of her. You know, they were pretty poor, yet they were able to produce a police constable. She was in fact a star in her family, and the elders who used her as an example for the younger ones. They all hoped that their kids will be as successful as Rosemary when they grew up. Fast forward to 2011, she met a young man called Maurice Mobasa. He was a staff at the United States Embassy. I am not sure how they two met, but soon after they met, they began a relationship. Maurice was described by people who knew him as a very loving and giving individual. He was single-handedly taking care of all his 13 siblings and his mother, who was too old to fend for herself. They all came first for him, and this would be a major reason for the occasional couples quarrel he and Rosemary had. While he believed in saving and taking care of their poor relatives, Rosemary would use all her earnings for herself alone and also to feed her serious gambling habits, which was something she had developed over time. So even though they had jobs, like good jobs that was paying well, the financial strain was beginning to get too much for their little family. Coming from a very poor background, Rosemary began telling her relatives who would ask her for money or any sort of help to consider taking a life insurance. She told them because of their poor status, which of course came with high mortality rates, it was a wise thing to consider, and she even offered to file these insurances and pay for the policies. That was the only way she could help, so that they should, in case anything happens to any of them, the rest of the family could get the payout. So Rosemary first filed this life insurance policy for her cousin, Madala Witness Homo. He was one of these guys who lived life on the edge, you know what I mean? So anything could easily happen to him at any time. She even recruited his mother to convince him into joining a burial society, which she did. A burial in South Africa is a big deal, just in case you were wondering why anyone would want to join a burial society. But one thing Rosemary did during the insurance filing procedure was that she listed herself as the sole beneficiary of the policy. You may be wondering how she could do that, right? It was because she had also listed herself as Homo's wife. How do you suddenly become a wife when you're actually a cousin if you don't have ulterior motives? Make it make sense, please. So fast forward to the month of March 2012, Rosemary's cousin witnessed Madala Homo just vanish into thin air, just like that. He disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he was. He didn't reach out to any of his family members like he would normally do. The family was, of course, very worried, but being poor, they didn't have the resources to look for him. What they were told from word on the street was that witness Madala Homo was on his way from work when some group of men attacked him, and that was the last time he was seen. So who were these men, and where did they come from? The family went to their dear cousin Rosemary. Being a police officer, they thought she could be of help in finding their cousin. Rosemary accepted to help. She in fact organized a search for Homo, as she promised her family she would do all it took to find her missing cousin. Investigations began, and soon enough a body was found at a location in Olifanfontein, which was only a couple of miles away from where Homo was last seen. The body was later identified as witness Madala Homo, and the COD was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had hit him hard enough with a heavy object on his head to take him out immediately. One would think since this was homicide, further investigations would be done, right? It wasn't like that in this case. Homo was buried according to traditional rites, and the poor family just moved on with their lives like nothing happened. Rosemary was in attendance at the burial, and she contributed about 200 rands, which is about, I think, $13 to that funeral, even though she got the payout from the insurance policy she took out on her cousin, which was about 100,000 rands. If you convert this to US dollars, this should be about 6,500 US dollars. Some report put a figure gotten from Homo's insurance policy at about 131,000 rands. Whichever figure it was established that Rosemary collected the insurance money on her cousin, witness Madala Homo, and she did nothing or even little to help with his funeral. The family had to borrow and beg to raise funds for the funeral, in fact, and when it was all over and done with, there was a lot of quarrels and misunderstandings because debtors came demanding for their money. In 2013, sometime around June of that year, Rosemary, out of the blue, called up her sister Audrey Ndlovu and asked her to dinner. Audrey lived in a rented room just a short distance away from Rosemary, and even though the invitation to dinner was kinda odd, she accepted, and that evening the two sisters made plans to meet at her room in Tembisa to eat and catch up. They didn't do this often, so Audrey was more than happy to have her sister Rosemary over. After dinner, Rosemary went back home, and that was the last time anyone would see Audrey alive. The next morning, Rosemary, according to her, tried to reach out to her sister to at least thank her for dinner the previous night, but she couldn't reach Audrey. She became alarmed and she requested that her fellow colleagues begin a search for her sister immediately. I don't know how she knew immediately that Audrey was missing and that a search was required and necessary, but this would be the second human that is reported missing in this family, and how the first case ended was not in a good way, so everyone was on the edge when Audrey was said to have gone missing. An alarm Rosemary had actually raised herself. Well, the very next day, Rosemary was at Audrey's house. She was crying bitterly. Audrey had been found on the floor of her own room, deceased by this time. As per the COD, she had not only been poisoned, but whoever did this to her had seen that the poison was not working fast enough. So they put a ligature around her neck and tugged at it until there was no more life left in her. They didn't care about her young son. They just squeezed the life out of her, knowing fully well that Audrey had a child who would easily have stumbled on her body. There was one thing common between Audrey's passing and that of her cousin, witness Madala Homo. Audrey had also taken out a life and funeral insurance policy as well. As poor as she was, living in her mother's one room in Tembisa, the life insurance and funeral payout was worth a little over 700,000 rands, which would be 45,000 US dollars at the time. And wait for it, the sole beneficiary was none other than her sister, Rosemary Ndlovu. It will later be said that while they had dinner, Rosemary poisoned Audrey's drink, hoping it would take her out. She left and returned to check if the deed was done, but when she found out Audrey was still alive and struggling, she put something around her neck and ended her. And while Audrey was laying out cold on the floor, her dear sister Rosemary picked up the phone and called the insurance company, pretending to be Audrey, gave affirmations that she, Rosemary, would be the sole beneficiary of her life insurance should anything happen to her. This was now 2 deaths in the family already. a family that didn't have the means but took out life insurances anyways. And anyone who did would just pass away shortly afterwards. Plus, the payout was going to only one person, yet no one said anything about this. Audrey's death was not investigated either. It was just the usual, sorry for your loss, we'll do all we can to find the culprits, and then nothing more. Everyone just went about their normal lives. By the next year, which was now 2014, Rosemary was a constable at the Tembisa South Police Station in East Rand, Huanteng. Work was going on pretty good. She was a usual jolly good soul. She had a lot of money to throw around. She was said to buy lunches for her colleagues whenever she wanted. She would give out money to anyone who asked for like a soft loan of some sort. She was generous to her new colleagues, and even though she had one of the lowest ranks, she drove expensive cars on and off. That made some of her colleagues to wonder how she made her money, because all of them were in the same police force and they knew what each other took home as salary. A constable in South African police force at the time took home about 7,000 to almost 15,000 rands a month. This figure is dependent on how many extra hours and overtime an officer works in a month, so they thought that she was a corrupt cop. But the thing was, after spending and giving out money, Rosemary would become very, very broke, and she would come into work very angry and grumpy that she had no more money. Soon enough, it was well known that she frequented a prominent casino in Johannesburg called the Empress Palace, which was located in Kempton Park. This simply meant she gambled a lot, and as such would come into huge amounts of money and would then lose it all again to gambling as quickly as she got it. Well, the rumors of her being a corrupt cop soon died down after it became known that she played at the casino and was pretty good at gambling. Now, fully living in Tembisa, in that same 2014, Rosemary had her first child, a beautiful daughter she called Maka and Nani. Remember, Rosemary's relationship with Maurice was not in the best of shape. Rosemary's gambling and frivolous spendings and selfishness when it came to money and the welfare of her family was tearing down the relationship. But when their daughter was born, it was thought that maybe this would help them see eye to eye. They both loved their daughter very much and they took very good care of her, but their relationship wasn't any better. They still had constant heated fights and arguments, and that would result to Maurice leaving their Clayville Tembisa home to go cool off, then return the next day, or he would just sleep in the car outside the home. This was a pattern until one fateful night in October of 2015. After yet another heated argument, Maurice left the apartment as usual to go cool up somewhere, but he never returned back to the house, and that was the last time anyone would see him alive. So it was now a few more nights and Maurice hadn't returned home, and a worried Rosemary went straight to the police station to report him missing. Investigations began immediately, and soon enough, that very same day he was reported missing, Maurice Mobasa was found deceased. He had been found dumped by the side of a road that wasn't frequented as much, close to the police station at the Olisfantfontein, and when he was found, the COD was not difficult to point out as he had more than 7 dozen obvious wounds on his body. Someone had taken a sharp kitchen utensil and driven it into his body more than 80 times. The strange thing was that no one knew why anyone would want to harm Mobasa. This was not the first time someone had tried to harm him. In the first attempt, he narrowly escaped being shot outside their home. On that day, he had received a call from Rosemary, who was in the hospital with her daughter. He asked him to bring more nappies to the hospital because they were running out of diapers. As Mobasa was preparing to drive out of their home at Tembisa Clayville, he came face to face with a hitman standing outside their yard waiting for him. The hitman's firearm apparently jammed and Mobasa took the opportunity to flee. He ran like his life depended on it, which he actually did. In the second attempt, Mobasa was asleep at home when suddenly the main bedroom caught fire. Bottles of petrol and gasoline had been placed under that bed, causing the room to just go up in flames. Rosemary was at home at the time of the fire with their then 6-month-old baby daughter, but nothing happened to any one of them, thank goodness. Then just weeks after this incident, Mobasa was gone. Whoever wanted him gone had succeeded. But by now you should know who wanted this to happen. But at this time, no one understood what was going on. The obvious signs were not as glaring for them to point accusing fingers. Maurice was loved by people around him, so people wondered what would have been the motive for this attempt on his life. They knew in this instance that it obviously wasn't robbery because more than 80 wounds was definitely an overkill, and he still had his wallet which had money in it on him, and his cell phone and identification card was still on him when he was found. The identification card was what actually they used to identify that the body belonged to him. Fast forward to when he was buried, there was no formal investigation into this case, but guess what? There was again a life insurance that was paid out to Rosemary to the tune of a little over 400,000 rands. And since she was the spouse, the US Embassy where Mobasa worked paid her an additional 100,000 rands. During his funeral, she contributed only 40,000 rands, so where was the rest of the money? It would later come out that Rosemary had in fact hired an individual to pose as her partner, Maurice Mobasa, as she filed life insurance policies on him without his knowledge, and she continued to pay the premiums on these policies up until his demise, all without him knowing. This was brought to light much later during her trial when the representative from Asupol, the insurance company, which she used, was shown a picture of Maurice Mobasa and was questioned if he was the person he had met when he went over to their Clavey home for him to sign documents. Well, he said no, that he had met a different Maurice Mobasa. This woman had taken out 16 life and funeral insurance policies in Maurice Mobasa's name. The first policy had been opened in 2011, the year they started dating, with the last taken out on June the 1st, 2015. 4 months before Maurice's demise. For how long had she been planning all of this? It seems right from the time they started dating, she had already marked him because of insurance policy money. Sometime later in 2016, one of Rosemary's nieces, Zanele Mota, called her up to say she was having financial troubles and she needed a place to stay so she could figure out things out, and Rosemary gladly opened her doors and welcomed her with open arms. They had only started communicating just recently after a very long hiatus. But not too long after she arrived, Zanele was walking at Kempton Park and a vehicle ran into her. She was rushed to the hospital and given treatment. She had several injuries, quite okay, but they were all superficial, not life-threatening at all. So she was given medication and discharged into Rosemary's custody that very same day. Everything was normal at first. It seems Zanele will make a quick recovery, right? So she tried to catch some sleep, but when night fell, she began to complain of excruciating pains in her chest. She could not sit still. She cried and cried for help, so Rosemary had no other choice than to take her back to the hospital the very next day early in the morning. Upon arrival, the doctors tried to figure out what must have been causing so much pain to Zanele. They tried all they could to help her, but sadly, she passed away. What the doctors would discover later on was that even though externally to the naked eyes she had only a few bruises, which obviously was from the initial accident, internally a lot was going on. Her liver was badly damaged and she had multiple fractures to her ribs. These injuries were not there when she was first discharged. So what had happened between then and then when she returned to the hospital? Rosemary was questioned and she said she didn't know what had happened because she had left Zanele by herself after bringing her home the previous day. There was nothing to explain the injury, so nothing was done. Another family member was gone, just like that. Zanele was a mother of 3, and her demise hurt a lot. The hospital didn't think there was foul play involved, so they didn't report it to the authorities. As such, there was no investigations into what might have happened to Zanele. But just like before, there was a life insurance policy involved, and Rosemary was again the sole beneficiary. She had taken out 3 different life insurance policies on Zanele in January, March, and May of that year. She received 120,000 rands, yet nobody batted an eyelid. They were only concerned that Rosemary did not contribute to the funeral, even though they believed she had the financial ability. They all watched her collecting insurance money, yet they still didn't connect the dots or think that something was amiss. So in 2017, I think it was in April of that year, Rosemary's nephew, who in fact was the brother to late Zanele, was visiting Pretoria. His name was Mayeni Mashaba. Mayeni told Rosemary about going to Pretoria, so Rosemary suggested, you know what, I can actually drive you halfway, then you can get a ride the rest of the way. It will make things a lot easier for you. So innocently, Mayeni accepted the offer. I mean, it seemed generous and he would be saving some money after all. So he hopped into her car and off they went. Rosemary dropped him off at a gas station where he was meant to hitch a ride. Then she made a U-turn and headed back home. But the very next day, here comes a call from the police. A body had been found. It had been found in Olifanfontein and it was that of Mayeni. As per usual, Rosemary did her cries, oh, I've lost a family member, life is cruel. Then she went straight to the insurance company to get a payout. So the thing was, Rosemary, just like in other times, had made him take out a life insurance, right? And had listed herself as his partner. But when it came down to it, she could not provide the proof they needed to determine if she truly was his partner. So the claim was rejected. So for this one time, she could not benefit from a family member's demise. Then yet another family member disappeared in January of 2018. He was Rosemary's nephew. His name was Brilliant Machego. Brilliant was in fact Audrey's son. Remember Audrey, the younger sister who was poisoned a few years earlier? Well, Brilliant had found out that Rosemary had collected the life insurance payout on his mother and he decided to confront her. Rosemary invited him over to her home in Tembisa on the 22nd of January so that they could talk things through, and that was the last time anyone saw or heard from him. A few days after no one had seen him, he turned up on the 24th of January, but not alive. His body had been dumped in Bucksburg Ridge, and his cell phone records showed that Rosemary was the last person he had spoken to, and a check on Rosemary's phone supported that they had been together almost all day the day prior to his disappearance. In fact, they drove together from Johannesburg to Bucksburg Ridge, so she was the last person known to have seen him alive. Brilliant Machego had not just a life insurance, but 3, and the beneficiary was Rosemary, who was listed as his mother. But yet again, she couldn't provide proof that she was indeed his mother, so the claim was rejected just like the previous instance. Report says she didn't take him out for the insurance money though. She only wanted to shut him up because he wanted to make trouble with Rosemary because of the payout she had collected from his mother's insurance. Whatever reason it was, only Rosemary knows the truth. This was now 2 family members who had passed under mysterious circumstances, and Rosemary could not get her hands on the insurance money, so she became very, very desperate. She was deep into gambling and was broke. All her money had gone into her bad habits, so she needed to come up with something, and very fast too. In that same January of 2018, Rosemary took out several life insurance and funeral insurance policies on her very own mother. But how was she going to collect on this if her mother was still alive? In her desperation for cash, she came up with a plan. One day, a man arrived at Rosemary's mother's home and knocks on the door. The poor old woman opens up and this man requests for water to quench his thirst. He was attended to lovingly and he left. What no one knew at the time was that this man, whose name was Lucky Wekize, had been paid 2,000 rands by Rosemary to do away with her own mother. But when the hitman had arrived at her home to carry out the hit, he met a loving old woman that he thought didn't deserve to go out in such a manner, so he instead pretended to be thirsty and requested for water, after which he disappeared without doing Rosemary's bid. When Rosemary's plan failed, she made another one, but this time with a different hitman, and the target was also different. So there was this man called Njabulo Vincent Kunene, whom she had once arrested before. I think it was on illegal possession of a firearm. This was several years prior, but Rosemary in 2018 thought Kunene would fit in perfectly into her plan, so she sought him out. She told him that she had the job for him, and this was to take out her own sister Joyce. But then, when he asked what about Joyce's children, because Joyce had children, Rosemary said that all 5 of Joyce's children were to be taken out as well. You can imagine. Her own sister. These were just kids. The last was just 6 months old and the oldest was just 14. They all knew and loved their aunt Rosemary, but here she was planning their fate. Now, Kunene had a criminal past and guaranteed he was a shady individual, but the thought of doing away with 5 young innocent children, all for nothing but just 15,000 rands which was promised him by Rosemary, was too much for him, so he went to the police instead with all he knew. He didn't care that he was already involved in the plot, right? He came clean and told the cops every single thing they needed to know about Rosemary and the plot. This was a very serious allegation against one of their own, so they needed concrete evidence, not just the word of an ex-convict. So they came up with a plan, and Kunene was going to be part of that plan. He was asked to go undercover. His car would be fitted with invisible cameras, and he was to get Rosemary into that car and then bring up conversations that will make her talk about the murder plot, right? So, to just incriminate herself and say what they will use to, charge her, while all of it will be caught on camera. So on that day, Rosemary got herself admitted in a hospital in mid-run for some undisclosed illness. I think this was supposed to be her alibi, and it was also to help her get a pass from work. So when Kunene called Rosemary up and told her they needed to meet to run through the details of what they were about to do, she accepted willingly. And he went to meet her and pick her up from the hospital. But this time, Kunene was not alone. He had someone with him who he introduced to her as a friend and accomplice who was also going to participate in the crime. According to him, considering there were 6 people total she wanted taken out at once, it was too much work to be done by one man. What Rosemary didn't know was that the said accomplice was an undercover policeman. So they took a ride together from Johannesburg to Bushbuck Ridge, while she fed them every detail on her sister and her family and how she wanted the crime committed.
Ayikho emakhaya yabona ukushisa number 1 nokuhamba number 1 manje ne masihamba manje niyohlangana naye ngimbize sihlangane somewhere mina mhlambe ngifake imoto laphana yabona ngimnikezele la philisi njabule yabona ngimtshele ngithi la maphilisi asiza ntambama mawulala uwaphuza womkhuhlane ngithi manje kuzingena isizini yomkhuhlane ngithi niwaphuze mani lala ngoba ayalalisana then nina nizokhona ukungena ke akunamabhatla lapha esibhedlela ngempela la esibhedlela nayo baba endlini uyazi ukuthi ngila esibhedlela so la esibhedlela ngicelile banginikeze i-pass out bathe ngibuye ngo-4 so lana noma ngafika ngo-5 6 7 akunandaba esilong ngibuyile so ngoba ngithi indawo yokushisa ifuna ngishise kusebusuku ngiklini mina nginakucala ngazi sebangitshela indaba mina kusasa ngiyavumbuka ngiyagijima ngiyekhaya ngicela amalungiselelo ngiyaklima ngenza zonke lezi zinto sikumoclaima ngoba yintwaneni next week imali izotholakala next week asithi Friday sithi sona siphepo Friday next week sidla kamnandi kahle nje.
It was a very long drive, I think about 5 hours or so. As they drove, Rosemary kept talking. The police all this while were listening in and waiting for the right moment to pounce on this heartless individual. They stopped by a gas station to buy petrol, which was supposed to be used in the arson. Then she pointed out her sister's house and gave the instructions that this is how it's going to be done, and it has to be done by 9 p.m. that very day. Soon after she had pointed out her sister's house to the supposed hitman, which was the major purpose of the drive, she was arrested as the police swarmed the car. There was a mountain of evidence on Rosemary. She was charged with 6 counts of murder for every one member of her family she had eliminated for insurance money. Madala Homo, Audrey, Maurice Mobasa, Zanele, Mayene, and Brilliant. At the end of it all, she had collected the total of 1.4 million rands. Some reports put the figure at 1.5 million rands. This would be approximately about 97,000 US dollars, money that she had gambled away. All of it. She had nothing left. It took a while for the prosecutors to have all they needed in regards to the passing of the family members because there was no proper investigations when it had happened. But finally they were able to build a case, and in 2021, October to be precise, the trial began. This will now be 3 years after her arrest. There were lots of witnesses who came forward to testify against Rosemary. Her family members, her fellow police officers, the undercover cop in the car with her, and Jabulo, the hired hitman himself. In total, there were about 40 witnesses willing to testify against Rosemary. Her family was very, very angry at her. As for Rosemary, I don't think she gave a damn. If you watch her in court, you will notice that this lady was cold-hearted and calculated. She was without empathy and she had no remorse. She posed for the cameras, she smiled at some point, made faces at the camera and her family. But then when testimonies started coming in and she saw that they had her demeanor changed and she became kind of like aggressive. She even once attacked a news crew outside the courthouse. She of course denied any wrongdoing, saying she was innocent, but in the same breath, she asked for forgiveness from her family members and apologized for their demise during mitigation of sentence. Does this make any sense at all, that you're apologizing for what you claim you didn't do? Rosemary's family, including the sister she had wanted to be burnt alongside her 5 children, came to court day in, day out for the proceedings. You can imagine how they felt knowing that their family member had been taking them out one after the other just for insurance money. Joyce had revealed that on the morning of the day the hit was supposed to happen, Rosemary had actually called her to ask her questions she considered weird, but she didn't think much of it at the time, but now it was all making sense. Like, she wanted to know at what times her neighbors were home and her relationship with them, and if her neighbors would come to her aid if her home was burned down. South Africa had hitherto seen none like Rosemary Ndlovu. It was even said that she had allegedly taken out a hit on the investigating officer after her arrest, but that plan was thwarted. This was the time she was removed from Johannesburg prison to Ngozi Maporo Correctional Center in Pretoria. There was just a lot with this woman. She was just causing problems, arranging hits left, right, and center. By the end of her trial on October 22nd of 2021, she was found guilty on all counts and she was handed 6 life sentences. 10 years imprisonment for each of the 7 counts of incitement to commit murder, 10 years imprisonment for the attempted murder of her mother, 5 years for defeating the ends of justice, 10 years for fraud. She will be 71 before she will be considered for parole. In May of 2022, Rosemary was back in court again, facing fresh charges. In the first matter, it's alleged that she paid a hitman to take out her boss and station commander, Colonel Ntipe Moluka, and Sergeant Bernard Mabinda, who was the investigating officer in her case. There was a co-conspirator who was on the run at the time. In the second case, she stands accused of plotting to take the life of the husband of one of her colleagues. This colleague of hers is also a co-conspirator. Her name is Nomsa Modal. It's alleged that the two planned to take the life of Modal's husband so that she could cash in on her husband's life insurance policies. As it is, we haven't seen the last of this crazy policewoman. She was just recruiting people to do the things that she was doing. Before I go, I know you'll be wondering what of Rosemary's daughter. Well, she claims the baby passed away in 2017. That case is still subject to investigations, as I understand. That's it for today, guys. Remember to subscribe if you haven't. Click on the notification, leave your comments, and send me your case requests on Instagram. Until next time, take care of you and yours.